Hi, it's Dwyer. Dwyercrime.blog, a free site. Gamblersadvisory.com, a free site. Today is Thursday, May the 19th, 2022. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, this video is one man's opinion, based on a childhood of talking to an older generation. Right? In a subsequent video, I'm going to talk about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. But I need for people to realize the times that were the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the period before we get to Robert F. Kennedy running for president in 1968. Now, in terms of self-impression, right, let me concede that technology, during my life at least, has never been better. I'm recording this video on a tablet computer that did not exist, the technology for it, when I was in college. Right? We now have the internet. We now have a connectivity that we simply didn't have in the past. But make no mistake, in my opinion, and this is a little before my time, going by self-impression, I personally don't believe during, let's say, the post-World War II period that there has ever been, in terms of the way Americans viewed themselves, a period of unparalleled prosperity on par with the 1950s. Right now, let me just say this. It is far from a perfect decade for women, for people of color. But we're talking about America's general self-impression. Now, the 1940s were about survival, right? World War II, and of course, radio. In the 1950s, America is rebuilding Europe. America moves in the direction of television, highways, suburbs, rock and roll, Brown versus the Board of Education, big cars with tail fins. Now, because of subsequent events, people have lost track of how things were in the 50s. The alpha in the room for the era, in my opinion, was Dwight D. Eisenhower. He towers over his vice president, Richard Nixon, and of course, Senator John F. Kennedy, who at that point is just a young senator. Understand that if you look at Eisenhower's popularity ratings, understand that Eisenhower was much more popular in office than John F. Kennedy. Right? Eisenhower's popularity ratings, quite frankly, are really at the top end. Presidents since then haven't had that level of sustained popularity. Now, we then get to JFK, who is made for television. He's a good-looking guy. He's young. He has a full head of hair. Right? He seems to be along for the ride. His former bootlegger father, Joseph, a philanderer by even Kennedy family standards, and that's saying a lot in a family that had Chappaquiddick and other incidents. thought he would hand the keys to the family kingdom to JFK's older brother Joseph, who was an Eisenhower-type figure. But Joseph Jr. dies in World War II. His playboy brother, and that's who he is, right? He's a playboy. He's rumored to be with a lot of women before he ever gets close to the White House. John F. Kennedy takes over the family mantle. Now, he was not what he seemed. Again, this is one man's opinion. This is my opinion. In between liaisons with much younger women and having drinks and socializing with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, we find out that JFK is a macro thinker. His campaign theme is audacious. He talks about a new frontier. Now keep in mind, this is after a very popular presidency. He's outside the box. In office, at the height of the Cold War, he starts the Peace Corps. He compromises, that's the word, to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis by agreeing to remove some American missiles in Europe. He recognizes that Eisenhower's Civil Rights Act of 1957, a time of poll taxes and grandfather clauses, voting restrictions on African Americans, which gets watered down by Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson, is not enough. So, and contrast that with what's happening today, right? Contrast this with Obamacare, which was written in part by lobbyists. In Kennedy's case, from the executive branch, his office authors and presents to Congress the most comprehensive civil rights bill up to that point in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1963. It is so revolutionary that it does not pass Congress. Understand, at the time you had members of Congress, James Easterbrook, Richard Russell, who were openly segregationists. Understand, Kennedy, in that environment, has Dr. King, who's a controversial figure. Let's remember, King's in prison during the 1960 election. Kennedy has Dr. King at the Oval Office. Kennedy supports the March on Washington. He has problems with the intelligence community. He fires Allen Dulles, who ironically, of course, ends up on the Warren Commission with segregationist Richard Russell, right, under Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, there is no playbook for this. Here is the youngest elected president in American history. He is not that popular. He barely won in 1960 and may have been helped by the mob in doing so. For a period of time, history tells us that he's sleeping with Judith Exner, who was sleeping with mob boss Sam Giancana. Several of the old guard are not fans, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who has had enough of his boss, the president's younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who JFK picked as Attorney General. And yet, with all of this chaos, I would argue that John F. Kennedy, out of necessity, evolves into, in my opinion, one of the best presidents in American history. The millionaire young playboy, we come to learn, is a macro thinker who will pay any price, bear any burden, to do what he thinks is in America's best interests, whether the polls agree with him or not. He's not an image. He is a reality. And then he is gunned down. In my next video, I'm going to talk about the assassination of his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Right? Folks should be warned that I question whether Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy. Right? I need for people to understand the times. I also question whether the mob killed John F. Kennedy, because the mob, of course, couldn't have faked the autopsy. Right? People need to understand, too, that older generations, the generation during which the Kennedy assassination happened, did not have the information that we have now. Understand, too, the Church Committee in the 70s, which concluded that they thought there was a conspiracy, did not have the information we have now. At a minimum, people need to realize that the 1960s are very clouded. Right? Everyone concedes that the CIA at one point was working with the mob to try to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Right? History shows us that Kennedy wasn't even advised that the American intelligence community had a hand in dethroning Patrice Lumumba, who was a duly elected leader of the Congo. Right? So just understand, against this backdrop, right? Kennedy, who was somewhat forced to pick, LBJ, ironically, one of my parents' favorite politicians ever, Donna Brazil's favorite president, right? Kennedy, who's forced to pick Lyndon Johnson after Johnson's friend, Sam Ervin of Watergate fame, revealed to the Kennedy campaign that they had information that Kennedy had Addison's disease, which was true, but which was not publicly acknowledged. Right? Understand that Kennedy, by firing Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and by taking certain steps that appall the intelligence community, such as failing to give air cover to the Cuban invaders during the Bay of Pigs, right? Kennedy was in a room of a lot of people who, quite frankly, may or may not have been working with him. Right? So from Kennedy's assassination, where, of course, Bobby Kennedy did not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, right? Things evolved to the point where LBJ is challenged by Clean Jean, who has the support of the anti-war movement, right? Let's remember, back then, America had a draft. The anti-war movement actually involved a lot of people who had been drafted, who were burning their draft cards, right? LBJ decides not to run for re-election. People need to consider that. We now know that LBJ was a bit of a bully president, right? He was a guy who would have meetings with other esteemed politicians, right? Senators, representatives. And he, of course, would then walk in the bathroom, continue the meeting with them, and then go sit on the john. Right? LBJ got a lot passed. The Great Society had its moments. But America's coming apart at the seams. Johnson then decides not to run for re-election. And into the race springs John F. Kennedy's younger brother. Right? I view Robert F. Kennedy like I view Michael Corleone in The Godfather. Right? The rest of the family is rough and tumble. Right? Joseph Kennedy, again, a bootlegger. Right? Former bootlegger. Had connections to the mob. Right? New people. We'll just put it that way. Right? They claim that he arranged for his son to win the West Virginia primary. You need to research that. If you're a serious student of the 1960 election, don't just look at Chicago. Don't just look at Illinois. Look at Texas. Understand the times. If you want to see corrupt elections, one of the all-time ones involved Lyndon Baines Johnson, who apparently got votes that were, according to reports, in alphabetical order in places. Right? So this is a different America. Bobby Kennedy seems to be a Boy Scout. Right? Bobby Kennedy makes a miscalculation. If you believe that the mob helped John F. Kennedy get elected President of the United States, or that the mob even innocently campaigned on behalf of John F. Kennedy, right? Keep in mind, there's supposed to be corruption in Chicago in the vote counting. Dead people are supposed to have voted. And of course, that's where the outfit was based. Sam Giancana's portion of the mob. Right? If you believe the mob played a role in getting Kennedy elected, it's simply astonishing that Bobby Kennedy would then turn around and come after the mob. Right? Joseph Kennedy ends up having health problems. Just understand, Bobby Kennedy comes after the mob with a ferocity. Right? There's a whole school of thought that Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante, and the mob decided they needed to get Bobby off their backs. So they took out John F. Kennedy. We now know that mobsters were very close with law enforcement. Right? Just understand, according to reports, Jack Ruby was supposed to be an FBI informant. Right? Things are blurred. Things are hazy. Then you get to the late 60s. And here is Bobby Kennedy running for President of the United States. Understand, too, the Democratic side of the ledger. The favorite, after LBJ backs out, is LBJ's Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. So Robert Kennedy is really almost committing heresy by taking on the current Vice President of the United States in a big skirmish that certainly was going to divide and weaken the Democratic Party. Now, we'll pick this up in a subsequent video where we talk about what I believe happened that night. Just understand the moment. Robert F. Kennedy had just won the California primary when he gets assassinated that night. There are many peculiarities. We'll discuss them in the Robert F. Kennedy assassination video. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you if you have a different recollection of the era. If you are from that time and you have a different vision of Eisenhower, you have a different vision of how America viewed itself. If you have a different vision of any of the people I've named here, Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, Robert F. Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, please feel free to leave those comments in the comment section of this video. Thanks for stopping by. For those hearing the podcast of this, my YouTube account is Esquire777. Again, Esquire777. The podcast is dwyercrime.blog. Thanks for stopping by.